Thank you so much, Professor Mormon, and to everyone for being here. It's really, first of all, good afternoon, and good day to the people who are on Zoom. It's really an esteemed privilege for me to be here because I've admired the Africa at Noon series from afar. And I'm especially grateful to Professor Emily Kalachi for inviting me here, as well as the faculty and staff at the African Studies program, as well as the Department of African Cultural Studies for hosting this event. So again, thank you to you all and to the future listeners for taking the time to engage with this research. So today I will be sharing a history of how Lagosians resisted housing demolition laws during the era of decolonization in Africa. In particular, I'll highlight the efforts of the Lagos Market Women Association as they resisted displacement and redefined freedom, one rooted in their ability to determine their residential arrangements. This story of anti-slum clearance protests provides valuable insight into how everyday people experience the end of colonial rule and struggle for longevity in the city. So I'd like to begin with a short story. There we go. So right there. So the images that you see on the slide capture the scene of what the Nigerian press called the quotes, the biggest anti-slum demonstration in Lagos, end of quotes. Today, Lagos is one of the world's fastest growing megacities and a critical economic center in Africa. But in 1956, Lagos Island was still a colony under British rule. This unprecedented mass rebellion took place in central Lagos, which is one of the oldest and most densely populated neighborhoods on Lagos Island. On the morning of June 28, 1956, hundreds of men and women gathered to stop the British government's housing demolition. The British planners referred to this project as slum clearance, but the residents of central Lagos saw it differently. Many Lagosians insisted that the British government was not trying to improve the housing conditions, but rather to evict Africans from the island. In the image titled Stampede, hundreds of people blocked anti-riot police officers from entering Port Novo Market Street, which is one of the residential areas in central Lagos. The police had been called after residents forced demolition workers out of the area around 8 a.m. For more than 4 hours, the crowd engaged in a tense standoff with the police. In the second image, we see women who are using their bodies to prevent demolition workers and the police from destroying their homes. By noon, the anti-riot squad had arrested and assaulted more than 100 people, paving the way for the destruction of central Lagos. While the residents lost the battle against housing demolition, they did not lose their stories. Stories of why their neighborhood mattered and why their claims to the city should have been prioritized. This uprising in Lagos unfolded during the broader wave of anti-colonial resistance for independence sweeping across Africa and Asia. Just 4 years after the Port Novo Market Street uprising, Nigeria gained independence from British rule in 1960. Lagosians would not always focus solely on nationalist campaigns for independence. Instead, many mobilized against government policies that threatened their access to resources or limited their representation in city planning bodies. The protests on June 28, 1956, marked a decisive moment in the residents' struggles to secure their place in the city, both during and after the end of colonial rule. And most importantly, the demonstration of the 1950s offers important lessons for contemporary movements against urban displacement, which continues to occur worldwide under the guise of development. Across many African cities, neoliberal governments are violently evicting low-income residents from informal settlements labeled as slums, all in the name of building world-class cities. Often the land is gentrified, transformed into beachfront or high-rise properties. As recently as March 7 of this year, the Lagos state government evicted 9,000 people from a waterfront community. By enforcing this demolition, neoliberal governments are creating what the late geographer Vanessa Watson called urban fantasies, whereby the visions of the city that prioritize elite and exploited interests are favored over those of the majority. The Central Lagos case provides insights into how urban residents have navigated the politics of resisting mass displacement and envisioning alternative planning policies. So today, the focus of my talk is on how members of the Lagos Market Women Association, how they protested housing demolition. And as some of you may know, the Market Women Association was one of the most influential women's groups in Lagos that primarily advocated for the interests of women traders. And the organization had been around since 1917. And most of the women in the organizations, they're mostly Yoruba-speaking women who had roots in Lagos as well as southwestern Nigeria. The women are very much known for their role, in collective protests as well as in advocating for the needs of women. So, the involvement in this protest is not specifically new. But what I want to use this narrative in this story to do is to really center, women's perspective in historical narratives about urban displacement in West Africa, because we don't often see the ways in which women were involved in making claims for housing rights, specifically when it comes to the West African context. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight their voices. Most importantly, I think this story also helps us to think about the wide-ranging political investment that women had in the city. Because, when we think about them as market traders, there's emphasis to think about their interests as solely focused on market policies and market politics. But this specific example, it helps to show that the women's political engagement actually extended beyond protecting their economic interests, expanding political parties, and advocating for national self-determination. Rather, members of the Market Women Association actively challenge policies like slum clearance that undermine the community's ability to claim a permanent status in the city. And in so doing, part of the larger intervention that my work is doing, it's really helping to bring the spaces like the houses and the neighborhoods that are often within the background, within the context of like urban history and also women's history as well as gender history, and show the ways that these women are making claims and protecting their interests as homeowners and renters, and also underscoring the diverse investment that women had in reshaping city politics and policies. And most importantly, another intervention that I'm making is really teasing out the class differences that existed among these women, because a lot of scholars tend to talk about them as sharing the same interests because they're traders. But this conclusion, it blurs the diversity that existed within this among these women. So following the works of scholars like Nwanda Achebe, I look at the diverse political as well as socioeconomic differences that shape the experience of individual women and their engagement in this anti-housing demolition protest. And most importantly, I'm also going to be building on the work of scholars like Judith Byfield and Patricia McFadden in thinking about the possibilities and limitation of this women's efforts in the anti-slum clearance protest, because this was a community effort. And what my research showed is that although the Lagos Market Women Association played a central role in this protest, their proposals did not always inform citywide coalition efforts. So through this case study, I want to show how the women not only resisted colonial state policies, but they also had to confront gendered hierarchies within broader social movements. So this is just an illustration of how the talk is going to proceed. So first, I'm going to talk about, how and why the British government decided to create this project that was called the Central Lagos Slum Clearance Scheme during the 1950s. Later, I'm going to talk about the discrepancy between how the planners actually saw Central Lagos and how the residents lived in the space. And the last part of the presentation would highlight the contribution of the Lagos Market Women Association to the protest against slum clearance. And I'm going to argue that the Central Lagos case, it illustrates how women struggle to assert their perspective and challenge the gendered hierarchies within social movement. So first, before I talk about how Central Lagos was targeted for demolition, I want to talk about why Lagos had this very unique role within this context of urban planning. So the two pictures that I have here, it helps to kind of give a sense of where Lagos stood within the context of Nigeria during the 1950s. So during the 1950s, Lagos was, Lagos Island specifically, it was the commercial and administrative center of British colonial Nigeria. And the British government created Nigeria by merging the different ethnic groups into three main regions that you see on the map: the northern, eastern, and western region. And what made Lagos unique was that this was the only city that was governed outside of regional boundaries. And most importantly, before the British invaded Lagos Island in the 19th century, Lagos was governed by indigenous Yoruba-speaking rulers who administered the town. And as some of you may know, it was also part of the Atlantic slave trade. So by the 1950s, the British government and some nationalist party, they had other plans for Lagos. Their initiative was centered centered around replanning Lagos in order to make it the symbol of Nigeria's national identity. And so you have this political goal for why Lagos was targeted for this urban planning project, but there was also an economic reason behind it, right? When we look at the ports in Apapa, this was one of the key main space where, the three regions, this is how they were able to transport the agricultural commodities that really fueled the wealth of their region out of Nigeria. So before Nigeria's economy became majorly dominated by oil in the 1970s, the three regions of Nigeria, they relied on Lagos to export the agricultural goods to the rest of the world. So because of this, the colonial officials and nationalist leader, they saw urban planning as a way of trying to cement their political and economic interests within the city. So another really important background is to help us think about how Lagos was governed, right? Because this also helps us to think about how the protesters organized their movement, and also, what it meant, the different authorities that they had to engage with in order to make their voices heard. So one of the things that's very unique about the context of Lagos is that it was governed under the direct rule policy, and this is very different for how the rest of Nigeria was governed under indirect rule. And indirect rule meant that the colonial authorities sort of governed through who they often saw as the indigenous authority. And in some cases, this were actually not really indigenous to the area. But in other contexts, you have the existing authorities who had governed the area before the British came in. So indigenous authorities under the indirect rule system were relied upon to collect taxes as well as enforce customary law. But within the context of Lagos, this is very different because the main figure that the British relied on to govern the colony was the Commissioner of Colony, who was like the middleman and was also a British administrator. And so for many of the people who live in the city, they had to submit their petition to the British, to the Commission of Colony before they can actually have engagement with the governor. And what's also important here is that the Commission of Colony was also the chairman of the Lagos Executive Development Board, and I'm going to call it the Development Board. This was the main authority that was in charge of the urban planning and the demolition of central Lagos. And beneath, the Executive Development Board, this autocratic system that we see here, you have all of these different entities that represented the interests of different groups across the city. So, the main groups that I will be highlighting is the Lagos Market Women Association, but I'll also reference the Homeowners Association during the talk. And so all of these different groups, they were competing for power among each other, as well as from the colonial state in order to make their voices heard and to sort of express their needs. So next, I want to talk about, this whole project that, is at the source of contention, and it's officially called the Central Lagos Slum Clearance Scheme. So first, we have a picture of the chairman of the Lagos Executive Development Board, who, as I said, was also the commissioner of the colony. And the second picture showed the area that was mapped out for clearance. And the third map refers to how the British government intended to orchestrate this project. So first, I want to talk about the second map. It's really critical. This is the area on Lagos Island that was marked out for demolition, and the area that was that's shown right here with the black, highlighted in black. It sits on a land that's about 69 acres, and about 20,000 people lived in, more than 25,000 people live in the space. But what's really interesting is that, the map tells a really interesting story. It also obscures a lot, right? Because as we know, any source, reveals as well as obscures different kind of information, like any kind of text or source. Is that part of what it obscures, that it actually erases the diverse neighborhoods that existed within the space, because the residents who lived there did not call it Central Lagos. They called it by the different residential areas that had existed in the area since the 19th century. So some parts of it were known as Ologbowo or Ereko or Oluwole. So this is how, the resident identified the space. But because of the slum clearance project, it became known as Central Lagos. So that then became the name that people used to call the space. And so the third map, it speaks to what the development board intended to do, which was to move the residents from Lagos Island to the Lagos mainland in a new settlement known as Surulere, which was 5 miles away. And the Carter Bridge is what connected the mainland to the highland. And so why did the development board select Central Lagos for demolition? their reason basically centered on the idea that Central Lagos was quote unquote the worst part of Lagos Island. They considered Lagos Island overcrowded and a space that, the roads were not, they said that the roads needed to be reconstructed. But this rhetoric of, projecting slum on spaces, again, other scholars have talked about this, David Morton, Adebide Adelusi, who's really kind of push back against, planning intervention that are remaking spaces, is that you have this, desire as part of the civilizing mission to really reframe Black spatial practices as uncivilized as well as contravening British metropolitan laws. So there's a long history of how spaces like this have been marked out as unordered and denigrated for planning intervention. But what's critical here in the 1950s is that this is then kind of like roped into the nationalist project. So it wasn't just about remaking the space; it was also about remaking it for nationalist processes as well as visions for the city. So how did the residents of Central Lagos, how did they actually react to this project? What did it mean for them to actually understand and inhabit their spaces before they became the subject of planning intervention? So I want to move a little bit beyond the planner's gaze by giving us a sense of what Central Lagos was like. So these two images were taken by a British sociologist, Peter Maris, between 1958 and 1959. And this is a couple of years after, the demolition had already started, but not all parts of Central Lagos had been demolished at this time. So Peter Maris was primarily interested in learning about the social and economic lives of the residents that lived there, because he really wanted to know what would happen to the way that the residents built their lives after the demolition was over. But I want to use the images to make two critical points. The first have to do with challenging the slum narrative that had been projected on the space. Because when you look at the houses, you have, the bungalow houses, you have, the structure right here, which was built with the combination of like sometimes red brick and mud, right? The kitchen is at the backyard, the toilet is at the back of the house, right? And these are the kind of like structures that are deemed inefficient and sort of like staining the image of the city. But one of the things that's really important here is that what they tell us is that they actually show the kind of architectural choices as well as construction practices that the residents are engaging as part of aligning with colonial building policies as well as transgressing against colonial building policies. So what would then be known as slums by the 1950s are actually spaces that people have built in trying to conform with how the British wanted the houses to be built. So the notion of having toilets at the back of the house, having kitchen at the back of the house, these were the kind of structures that British government had prescribed as part of how cities needed to be built. But at the same time, so not all residents were reacting to colonial policies. Some of them simply wanted to build these houses because they had the money to do so, or because they had new ideas about the kind of architectural stuff that they wanted to build. So in other words, by the time we get to the 1950s, when new architectural structures like indoor houses are being prescribed, it's also important to understand that these structures also exist because of how residents are resisting colonization and also how they're trying to illustrate their own, architectural styles that they have. So the slum narrative needs to continue to be challenged, but we have to understand the context through which this building came to be. The second point that I want to make has to do with what these structures represent in terms of what was at stake for the residents when it comes to why they were resisting displacement. Because one of the things that were very much prevalent in the press at the time was that the residents had this very meaningless resisting because they were protesting against living in quote unquote squalid conditions, right? And as I said before, that's an imposition of a perspective in terms of like really not allowing us to see how and why these structures came to be. The other has to do with what was at stake for the residents. Many of the things that were at stake was that many of them will be losing the extended family ties and businesses that they actually had created in the area. So Central Lagos was inhabited by majority Yoruba-speaking groups whose connections to the area actually dated by centuries. So the homeowners, they designed and live in bungalows and one-floor houses that again, these structures were similar all across Lagos Highland. And I think it's also a very important point because, again, when you see this kind of pictures, there's the idea that Central Lagos was the slum, quote unquote, right? But this kind of structures were all over Lagos Island. They were not unique to the space. But then again, you have the ways in which the space was essentialized as the, quote unquote, the worst part. And again, you have the similarity of households, extended family living arrangement across Lagos Island. Many people use their backyards for bathing and cooking. And the blue arrows also kind of tell us about the commercial activities that are going on in the area. A little girl is setting items she's hawking some items on a tray. You have another woman who has set out an item in front of the house. And when you look at the men and the women who are standing across from the house, they're most likely speaking in the Yoruba language. It could be friends, it could be neighbors. So you have this very communal residential arrangement that has developed in this space. And so, Peter Maris's research allows us to see that for many of the tenants and homeowners, they value this type of residential arrangements because it was very much central to how they saw themselves as keeping their families together, because you have multiple generations that live in the same space. And in some cases, the ancestors were actually buried in the house. And most importantly, Peter Maris also found that Central Lagos was also a place with mixed income. So you have middle class and poor people that live alongside each other. And so whether one was renting or owning, the resident had a shared vision of Central Lagos, which was not as a slum, but as a vital part of the city's future, because it was a place that would enable them to preserve their family houses, their social bonds, and economic network. So in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to talk about I think the technology is failing me here. Oh, thank you. So in the rest of my presentation, I'm really going to center how the members of the Lagos Market Women Association protested the housing demolition. One of the things that the intervention that I'm also trying to make is also methodological in terms of like how to really unheard the voices of these women. Because one of the things that's very interesting is that in the existing literature on this topic, you have very marginal references to women's involvement in this protest. But there's also another challenge in terms of archival records, because when, I did a lot of my research at the Nigerian National Archive in Ibadan, and the archive has a lot of, letters and petitions from the Market Women Association itself. But most of them tend to focus on the opposition to colonial taxes and market policies. So to really understand the role of these women in this protest specifically, I had to turn to the Nigerian newspapers. And, the way that I read the newspaper is very similar to the ways that historians like, Jacqueline Beto Mogwe was here, and Derek Peterson was at the University of Michigan, in terms of reading the newspapers as actors and sources, right? So that's the way that I'm engaging with the newspaper in trying to tell the story. So I have samples of headlines from the newspapers that I use in my research here. And, the headlines, they speak to the Central Lagos demolition issue. Here are the front pages that are kind of telling, give different stories about this event. So some are talking about the protests, some are talking about, the financial compensation that the British government would give the homeowners, and also the kind of budget for the slum clearance plan. And, with two of the newspapers, we have the West African Pilot and the Daily Service. These two newspapers are connected to the nationalist political parties, and they've been around since the 1930s. The Daily Times, on the other hand, was owned by British businessmen who hired Nigerian editors to sort of write the story and be the editors for the paper. And it's often kind of referred to as a pro-British newspaper out of the three newspapers that are seen here. But one of the things that I think is really important here is that these labels are not necessarily efficient to understand the overlapping and the divergent perspective among the three newspapers. Because when you read all three very closely, they have very different ways in which they're still promoting the principle of what they call slum clearance, even if they disagree about where the project itself should take place. So I think we kind of need to sometimes look beyond the label to really read very closely the point that the newspapers are making, and also think about the voices that are represented or excluded from the press. And so when it comes to reading the voices of the Lagos Market Women Association, I sort of see the press as creating this paradoxical dynamic. They're providing space for public expression, but they're also underreporting the women's perspective at the same time. And there are also the challenges with trying to find the voices of women who are not writing in English. And, they were not published in the women's column as many of the Western educated women did. So to uncover women's presence in the press, I closely analyzed the newspapers for mentions of women's names at the rallies, pictures. I looked at pictures, the quotes, and as well as cross-reference names that I found in the paper with petitions and travel documents. And so what this approach revealed is that the women's struggle against housing demolition, it actually extended beyond the Port Novo market scene uprising that I talked about earlier on, because they had been integral to the broader campaign against urban displacement since 1951. And these records, they highlight both the challenges that women faced in making their voices heard and the competing interests that shaped their criticism of colonial planning laws. So one of the earliest examples that I found of when members of the Market Women Association began involved in this protest was in this short article that was published in the Daily Service, which was owned by the Nigerian Youth Movement. And when you look at the headline, it conveys the idea that the youth movement is bringing all of these different entities from Lagos together to make their voices heard against the slum clearance project. So this was published right after the development board announced that it was going to start this project. And so, it was pretty significant to kind of think about the Nigerian movements, including the Market Women Association as part of the group that would organize this protest. And it kind of speaks to the party's own recognition of the women's long-term political activism within the community. For example, in 1945, the Market Women were integral to the first national general strike that happened in Nigeria. They provided moral and financial support to Nigerian male workers. So pretty much known as established figures within the broader context of really providing community-wide care and, being very supportive when it comes to trying to promote the interests of the community. And so by 1951, they sort of continued this long history and tradition of being present at this, city protest. And so most importantly, you have many of their members lived in central Lagos because most of the women that worked there were traders. Some of them lived, they rented rooms, others, owned property with the extended family. Another thing that's really important here is the headline of the newspaper. Because when you look at it, it says Lagos meet to protest against LEDB land acquisition. They are not calling it slum clearance. They're calling it the land acquisition project. In other words, this was about land eviction. It wasn't about improving their livelihood. And this is a common argument that you find as you read the newspaper throughout the course of the project. So when the meeting was organized on April 9th, the first article offers a summary of the meeting and included speeches from the speakers, and it gives you a sense of the name of the people who actually showed up there. And one of the people that were invited and that spoke at this mass meeting is the woman that you see right here. Her name is Madam Rabiatu Yalode. Yalode was born in 1883, and she was a very wealthy textile trader who was very prominent and well-known for advocating on behalf of, the traders, as well as working with other women's group in Lagos. And so, the fact that she's here is not necessarily unique, but it's also very important to highlight the distinction between her and, the largely working class and poor members of our association. So when you read the article very closely, it talks a lot about the speakers, the summaries of their speeches. And at the end of the meeting, they all concluded that they wanted the development board to actually suspend this project because it did not fulfill the interests of the people that lived there. Iyalode's speech was actually very different from what the speakers from the political parties actually said. She actually called for the Nigerian youth movement to unify with other political parties that were its rivals as a way of actually challenging the demolition. And I find this very striking because she was most likely calling attention to the disunity that have emerged within the Market Women Association as well as within political organizing in Lagos. So because by 1951, the Market Women Association was already split along party lines. So women like Yalode belonged to one party, another faction within the Market Women Association belonged to another party. So Yalode was using this occasion to really kind of try to heal the rifts within the Market Women Association as well as within the political party, because this was an opportunity to have a much more stronger collective resistance. But when Dr. Akinola Maja, who was the chairman of the Nigerian movement, responded to Yalode's comments, he actually, he called the proposal unfeasible because he claimed that the other parties were not trustworthy enough and that it was the Nigerian youth movement should really kind of take on the mantle of planning this meeting. I find that very important because it showed how the challenges that the women had in moving the youth movement stance in a very different direction, right? Because now you have the opposition that's very divided in terms of how they would fight this housing displacement project. And so this is, one way to kind of think about the ways in which, the women, they had the same fears of housing demolition as their male counterparts, but their opinions were not always prioritized. So it helps us to see the kind of gender exclusion that's happening within this grassroots organization. Another really important point here is that, when you read the daily newspaper, this is another example of how it has its limits in terms of the kind of knowledge that we can gain from it about what women were actually doing at this time. Because what the paper tended to do was to kind of like emphasize the perspective of the political party and the leaders of its association. So this helped us to show how the newspaper is an incomplete source when it comes to being a knowledge producer as well as a witness to this political event that I'm talking about. But nonetheless, you have this disagreement about how to move forward. The protesters, they still had some impact because they were able to push the British government to revise this approach. So by January 1952, when the British government finally approved this quote-unquote slum clearance project, one of the things that they did announce, which was very new and different, was that they would allow the homeowners to buy back to buy back their land, and it would give them loans as a means of buying back their land. This was a really critical, important addition because when I read, the minutes and the discussion between the governor and the planners, it was very clear that the protest had a lot to do with why they decided to make this decision. Because they had, they continued to hear that many people thought that this was an opportunity for the British government to evict Africans from their land. So as a way of trying to calm down the community, it was an attempt to try to give some kind of concession, right? So I read the concession as a kind of success of how influential and important many of the protests had been in pushing the government to move in a different direction. Nonetheless, the slum clearance project was still on, but at this point, Central Lagosians did not know when the project would start because they didn't have the money at this point. So many people continued to kind of move on with their lives as they normally did at the time. But then once it was around May 1954, the project kind of took another turn. And this is when we see the increased involvement of Nigerian ministers in the process of realizing this housing demolition project. And the Council of Ministers is a very critical group here because it was like the new governing authority that was introduced as part of Nigeria's transition into self-governance. So the group was very much modeled after the British Prime Minister's cabinet. So in the case of Nigeria's Council of Ministers, the British governor, he served as the president of the council and then appointed, Nigerian politicians who were elected from the three regions to be members of the cabinet. And you have Minister Kingsley Mbadiwe was the one who was in charge of urban planning. So that newspaper showed him going to what the Daily Time kind of captured as the slums of Central Lagos, which is really one house, to try to basically make a plea to the rest of Lagos to support this project. So again, this is also the ways in which the newspaper is also manipulating images as a means of trying to promote this project. But again, there was still many concerns about whether or not this project was actually serving the interests of Nigerians or serving the interests of Europeans. But to someone like Kingsley Mbadiwe, this was very much central to what we make Nigeria this newly critical nation within this emerging decolonizing world. So for him, this was really critical, and urban planning became part of this nationalist effort. So nonetheless, the opposition by the women continued, and one of the big shifts was some of the women actually took, they adopted a transnational approach to their campaign. So here we have an image of Madam Abiodun Ogundimo, who was also a market leader, and Dr. Ibiyinka Olorunnibe, who was the first mayor of the Lagos Town Council, at a mass meeting that was organized by another political party, the Democratic Party in 1954. So the Democratic Party was the other party that Yalode was talking about earlier on for the youth movement and for the group to come together, but obviously that vision was not realized. Nonetheless, the Democratic Party had its own different agenda, which was to send Madam Ogundimo and Olorunnibe to London to petition Queen Elizabeth II to suspend the Central Lagos Slum Clearance Scheme. So by calling for the Queen's intervention, the delegates appealed to British imperial power instead of disengaging from it. As a result, what the Democratic Party did was reinforce Lagos' existence status as a British colony under the sovereignty of the Queen, despite the negotiation for independence. So the Democratic Party decision to send delegates abroad was not unique. Historian of Black internationalism, Mark Matera, has shown that people of African descent actually turned London to a site for resisting empire. And so it was very common for colonial subjects to travel to London to submit sign petitions when, local authorities rejected the appeal. But what made the Democratic Party's protest stand out was that this was the first time in the history of Nigeria, in the history of the Lagos Market Women Association, that a member of the Market Women Association would actually be part of an international delegation. And so exploring Madam Ogundimu's travel, a response to historians Keisha Blaine's call for the study of the activism of working class women and women with limited literacy in English within Black internationalist movement. So Ogundimu's was a woman who had very limited Western education. And, our life kind of contrasted with those of, Western educated women were often studied for forging ties with international groups. So by traveling to London, Ogundimu basically brought a transnational approach to the advocacy efforts of the working class members of our organization. But it's still important to sort of highlight Ogundimu's privilege, because she owned her own property, and she was also part of the landowning families in Lagos, and she spoke Pidgin English. And I highlight her background not to diminish her contribution, but to again emphasize the class differences among the market women. So despite, Ogundimu and a lot of members' efforts, they went to London and came back in December of 1954. The Council of Ministers, they came back to Nigeria after petitioning the Queen. Nonetheless, the Council of Ministers was still adamant about continuing this project. So, and one of the, indication that this project was still ongoing was the quick notices that were sent to the homeowners in 1955. And one of the things, the notices definitely, it gave the homeowners the fact that this was really going to be realized. And in the notice, homeowners were required to submit their property titles for compensation within 14 days. And if they refused to do so, they would either be fined £50 or sentenced to 6 months in prison. So this quick notice definitely galvanized a new movement. And this was the creation of an homeowners association. I would call it the Residents Association, but I could talk about the nuances within it. But I think the Residents Association is much more appropriate in 1955. And what the group did was they were trying to call for the suspension of the Central Lagos, of the demolition. Again, this has been the continuous demand that people have been making since 1951. And one of the things that's really unique is that in the petition that they submitted, you have members of the Market Women Association, like Madam Rabiatu Yalodu, who I talked about earlier on, that signed the petition. So this is also another evidence of how the women's group continues to be a critical part of this mobilization efforts. And most importantly, besides the petitioning, you have other forms of engagement, like the street protests that you see there, whereby many women, thousands of women stormed the streets, demanded the suspension of the demolition, and basically claiming that they would now move to Surulere. But by the time we get to 1956, this is when the uprising happened. And I juxtapose both because, when you look at the previous headlines, the uprising is often deemed as a riot, right? But I think that language actually diminished the long-term advocacy that the resident had been making in order to have the suspension of the demolition. And so this was the climax. This was like the last resort that the residents had to turn into violence as a means of stopping this demolition. And so, once, the police stormed the area, assaulted and arrested a bunch of people, that diminished the level of resistance, but it didn't necessarily stop many people's pushback against this project. So this was the houses that many people were forced to live in after losing their property on Lagos Island. So when you look at the Surulere houses, they have backyard gardens, indoor flush toilets, indoor kitchens, which are very rare on Lagos Island, and also in central Lagos, where many of them used to live in. And when you look at the images, with the bungalow houses, it's also really important to kind of read them as part of how the planners are trying to dismantle the communal living arrangement that had long defined life on Lagos Island. Because, the residents are asked to live in 1 or 2 rooms, even though you have, occupancy and arrangement that are centered around the extended family life. And so what they were trying to do by promoting this like nuclear family residential model is also contributing to what you can see as the normalization of heterosexualization and heteromonogamy, to kind of borrow from my colleagues Kwame Otu's work on this subject. And so this was a way to kind of rearrange social structures in the process through the use of architecture. And so nonetheless, the displaced people, they had their own meaning and use for the space that differed from how the planners actually envisioned these structures. And, drawing from, again, the work of Peter Maris, who actually interviewed many of the residents in the 1950s, he found that some people actually did enjoy living there. And so this was, couples who wanted to live separately from their extended families. But one of the things that was common between the people who did not want to live there and the people who wanted to live there was that living there actually increased their cost of living. Because now you have homeowners that didn't pay rent before, forced to pay rent to the development board. Many of them had to now also pay for transportation to move from the mainland to the highland, when previously they used to walk from their houses to their place of employment, or work from their houses to the market, right? So living on Lagos Island, they contributed to a lot of hardship, which is obviously very common within the context of many mass displacement urban renewal project. Some people died from it, some people lost their businesses. What's really interesting is that even though you have this forced relocation and police brutality, you have other ways through which many of the residents continue to challenge the economic hardship that had occurred to them by living in central Lagos in a very different way that was not centered around like street demonstration and mass protests, right? And I can talk about how that continued on into the 1960s during the Q&A. So I'm just going to conclude by going back to two of the figures that I talked about in the presentation. So in conclusion, this presentation has highlighted how Lagosians opposed the Central Lagos Sanctuary Scheme during the end of colonial rule in Nigeria. Specifically, it foregrounds the voices and initiative of market women association leaders like Madam Iyalode and Ogundimo. Their activism remained a critical aspect of how Lagos women challenged housing demolition during the 1950s. While Lagos women like Iyalode and Ogundimo were well known for their political activism, championing causes such as women's suffrage, taxation, and labor rights, their fight for housing rights has remained largely unrecognized. This history is not just about women employing militant political strategies. It is also about their struggle to assert their perspective and reshape the role of mass-based organizations. Though they continued their long-standing activism, they often found themselves unable to fully challenge the hierarchies and power dynamics within their own communities. While demonstrators united around concerns about housing, factors such as gender and ethnicity influenced how they resisted displacement. This perspective helped us to avoid homogenizing resident experiences, but to instead recognize how competing interests shaped claims to the city. Thank you so much for listening.